The Fox News Alert. I'm James Rosen. Bret Baier is on assignment and will join us shortly. The American student who fell into a coma while in North Korean custody and who was returned home last week has died. Correspondent Kristen Fisher brings us this late-breaking story, including allegations of physical abuse by the regime in Pyongyang. Good evening, Kristen.
James, this awful announcement came straight from Otto's family. They say he died around 2:20 this afternoon, surrounded by his family. He'd been in a state of unresponsive wakefulness ever since he was brought back from North Korea last week. His family says, quote, when Otto returned to Cincinnati late on June 13th, he was unable to speak, unable to see, and unable to react to verbal commands. He looked very uncomfortable, almost anguished. Although we would never hear his voice again, within a day, the countenance of his face changed. He was at peace. He was home, and we believe he could sense that. Well, as for his captors, the North Koreans, today his family said this, quote, unfortunately, the awful, torturous mistreatment our son received at the hands of the North Koreans ensured that no other outcome was possible beyond the sad one that we experienced today. Now, when Otto arrived back in the U.S., his doctors said that he'd suffered severe brain damage, likely due to lack of oxygen, but it wasn't clear exactly what caused it. Otto had spent nearly a year and a half imprisoned in North Korea. He'd been sentenced to 15 years hard labor for, according to the North Koreans, stealing a propaganda poster. The world watched his tearful confession. He was just 21 at the time, and he was wearing a jacket that made it home to the U.S. with him. Here's his father speaking to reporters last week.
I'm able to wear the jacket that he wore when he gave his confession. I'm not confessing, I'm speaking, but Otto, I love you and I'm so crazy about you, and I'm so glad you're home. You are such a great guy.
Now, at that press conference, Otto's father also praised President Trump for the role that his administration played in bringing his son home. And just moments ago, the president released a statement about Otto's passing. He offers his deepest condolences to the family, and then he said this, quote, Otto's fate deepens my administration's determination to prevent such tragedies from befalling innocent people at the hands of regimes that do not respect the rule of law or basic human decency. The United States once again condemns the brutality of the North Korean regime as we mourn its latest victim. James?
Otto Warmbier was 22 years old. Kristen Fisher, thank you so much. Now to another hot spot, the Middle East, site of the Syrian civil war and the battle against ISIS. This already complex business with lots of hostile actors on the ground just grew even more dangerous. The U.S. backing Syrian rebels has shot down a Syrian Air Force jet. And Russia, backing its client, the regime of Bashar al-Assad, is now threatening to do the same to U.S. pilots. Add to that Iran firing off ballistic missiles at ISIS in the very same theater. We have Fox team coverage. Bret Baier at the United Nations with the international reaction to the situation. We begin with national security correspondent Jennifer Griffin at the Pentagon. Good evening, Jennifer.
Good evening, James. It's the first time since 1999 that a U.S. jet has shot down another warplane in air-to-air combat. The last 24 hours have shown just how crowded and complicated the battle space in Syria is, raising concerns that the U.S. may find itself in a proxy war, not just with Russia, but also Iran.
A day after a U.S. Navy F-18 fighter jet downed a Russian-made Syrian warplane near Raqqa, Russian officials warned that U.S. and coalition warplanes operating west of the Euphrates River over Syrian government-controlled areas would now be tracked as potential targets.
We call on everybody to avoid unilateral actions, to respect, I stress once again, Syria's sovereignty, and to join our work, which is coordinated with the Syrian government.
The Russian Defense Ministry announced it would no longer use a deconfliction hotline established to prevent mishaps. But the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Joe Dunford, said the hotline is still operating.
We have an effective link between our operations center in Qatar and the Russian Federation on the ground. When I left the building this morning, we're still been communicating over the last few hours.
U.S. Central Command said the coalition warned the Syrian plane through the Russian hotline to stay away after the Syrians ignored a show of force by a U.S. F-18 flyby and bombed the U.S.-trained forces, the American pilot got the order to shoot down the Syrian jet, killing its pilot. U.S. Central Command issued the following statement, quote, "The coalition does not seek to fight Syrian regime, Russian, or pro-regime forces partnered with them, but will not hesitate to defend coalition or partner forces from any threat." The Pentagon has positioned more warplanes over Syria.
I'm confident our forces have the capability to take care of themselves.
Today, Iran's Revolutionary Guard issued a stark warning to ISIS militants after firing 6 ballistic missiles across Iraq into ISIS strongholds not far from U.S.-backed forces in eastern Syria Sunday.
Tehran is not London or Paris. It was a small action we carried out. If they make a mistake, deadlier strikes will be blown to them.
Drone footage released by the Iranians Sunday is said to show the Iranian missiles hitting the ISIS targets. Retaliation, Tehran said, for 2 recent terror attacks claimed by ISIS, one on Iran's parliament that killed more than a dozen people.
The U.S. was not given any warning about the Iranian missiles. Earlier this month, the U.S. shot down an Iranian drone in southern Syria. This is the 4th time in a month the U.S. military has fired on pro-regime forces backed by Russia and Iran. James?
Jennifer Griffin at the Pentagon tonight. Jen, thank you. Now with more on the diplomatic fallout from events in the Middle East, our own Bret Baier is on location at the United Nations. Good evening, Bret, and tell us, if you could, what you see happening behind the scenes there at the UN between the U.S. and the Russians.
Yeah, James, good evening. There are talks behind the scenes. Obviously, this is a big event. Here at the United Nations, they continue to communicate, but the real point is the military-to-military cooperation and the threat that it is not going to exist, or the deconfliction you heard in Jennifer's piece. But there is perspective here that U.S. officials point out, and that is, even after the April Tomahawk cruise missile firing into Syria by the U.S., there was a threat from the Russians as well. It never developed into anything because, for the most part, U.S. fighter jets fly east of the Euphrates. They don't cross over into west. They are striking ISIS targets on the east. So the deconfliction is a rare event. They do want to have that line open, however, and the communication is kind of a scrambled effort here behind the scenes.
Bret, the UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, has been quite outspoken about Russia up there in New York, but on this issue, this threat to shoot down coalition airplanes involving U.S. airplanes, she's been fairly quiet thus far.
Well, that's right. The administration, I think, James, is trying to speak with one voice. The voice so far speaking has been the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, talking about that deconfliction, and they're being very sensitive to try to coordinate the message this administration is on something this tense.
Now, Iran, of course, is a major player in the Syrian conflict, and they've hardly been quiet in recent hours.
Well, that's right. They fired 7 ballistic missiles from western Iran, a city called Kermanshah. They flew over Iraq into eastern Syria, striking ISIS. Now, that is in retaliation, they said, for the terrorist attack inside Iran. The question, however, is what other message that sends from Iran, basically firing ballistic missiles over Iraq. It also sends a signal to the Saudis that those ballistic missiles could easily go into Saudi Arabia or other U.S.-backed operations throughout the region. So multi-layers here. The Iran concern is real and high at this hour. And
a real concern for the Saudis, given that they've been battling Iranian-backed troops in Yemen in recent years. Finally, before we let you go, Bret, we have a very special interview that you taped earlier today that's going to appear on this program in a few minutes. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's why I'm here in New York, really, James. An American icon, Jack Nicklaus. We're going to talk golf, life, and a little bit of politics later on in this show.
I know that means a lot to you, a hero for you and for many Americans. Bret Baier on location at the United Nations in New York. Bret, thank you.
Thanks, James.
And this is a Fox News alert. At the top of this program, we reported on the death of Otto Warmbier, the 22-year-old student from Ohio who was recently returned from North Korean custody in a coma, apparently after severe physical abuse was done to him. We now have sound from President Trump commenting on the death of Otto Warmbier, the president having spoken with tech leaders in the state dining room.
Otto Warmbier has just passed away. He spent a year and a half in North Korea. A lot of bad things happened, but at least we got him home to be with his parents. We're so happy to see him, even though he was in very tough condition, but he just passed away a little while ago. It's a brutal regime, and we'll be able to handle it.
Also at the White House tonight, there appears to be a shakeup in the works in President Trump's press office. Chief White House correspondent John Roberts has the latest, as always. Good evening, John.
James, good evening to you. Fox News has learned in recent hours that Sean Spicer, the press secretary, will be getting a new position at the White House. He will be promoted to be the equivalent of the Deputy Chief of Staff for White House Communications. It really is a reflection of the tornadic flow of information here. In his new role, Spicer will oversee both the press office and the communications shop, and the new press secretary and the new director of communications will report directly to him. No word yet on who will replace him as press secretary, though the president is said to be very fond of Sarah Huckabee Sanders and likes her performance behind the podium, though I imagine what we're hearing is they may go somewhere else for the press secretary because she's not really all that interested in the job. One area that will remain outside of Sean Spicer's jurisdiction, that is the Russia investigation. That issue will remain the purview of the president's outside counsel.
It's an honor to have you at the White House.
Meeting with Panama's president in the Oval Office today, President Trump ignored shouted questions about the Russia investigation.
Are you under investigation?
But the public face of the president's legal team, Jay Sekulow, was saying plenty, appearing on 4 Sunday shows and 2 morning programs today to declare the president is not under investigation and that he did nothing wrong in firing James Comey because both the Attorney General and his deputy recommended Comey be replaced.
There's a recommendation for the removal of James Comey. He had been thinking about that as well. He then takes action that they recommend to remove James Comey. And now, according to the Washington Post theory, he's under investigation for taking the action that the Department of Justice told him to take. So this whole thing, if you look at it in that way and you just lay the case out like that, there's nothing to investigate.
The Washington Post last week reported the president was being investigated for possible obstruction of justice by special counsel Robert Mueller. ABC News later reported that Mueller hadn't decided whether to investigate him yet. On Fox News Sunday, Sekulow admitted, well, he really didn't know what was going on.
Well, but you don't know that he isn't under investigation now, do you?
Well, no one's notified us that he is, so I can't read people's minds, but I can tell you this, we have not been notified that there's an investigation of the President of the United States. So that nothing has changed in that regard since James Comey's testimony.
Well, the president seemed to take a critical shot last week at Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein in a tweet. Press Secretary Sean Spicer today said the president has full confidence in Rosenstein. First son-in-law Jared Kushner may be shopping for a new attorney to represent him in the Russia investigation. His current attorney, Jamie Gorelick, worked with Robert Mueller at WilmerHale. In a statement to Fox News, Gorelick saying, quote, after the appointment of our former partner Robert Mueller as special counsel, we advised Mr. Kushner to obtain the independent advice of a lawyer with appropriate experience as to whether he should continue with us as his counsel.
In the meantime, Jared Kushner will have his sights set on the Middle East. He is scheduled on Wednesday to travel to Israel, where he will meet with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Jerusalem and then the leader of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, in Ramallah. The president is dispatching him over there, James, to try to take advantage of what he believes is a window of opportunity to try to move the Middle East peace process forward. James?
John Roberts tracking so much for us from the North Lawn tonight. John, thank you. And special counsel Robert Mueller is beefing up his team of lawyers and investigators. Tonight, correspondent Doug McKelway looks at who these people are and what we know about their backgrounds and political views.
President Trump's legal team and his defenders are taking an aggressive defensive stance now that special counsel Bob Mueller has announced the hiring of 12 attorneys, some of whom appear to harbor political leanings.
The first 4 names are all people he gave to Democrats. Now, in this environment with a Justice Department where 97% of the donations for last year went to Hillary, 97%. Explain to me why I should relax as a Republican.
The only thing that really has changed is the president is attacking Bob Mueller, and therefore Newt Gingrich is attacking Bob Mueller. But the reality is that members of Congress on both sides of the aisle find Mr. Mueller to be a man of incredible integrity and courage.
Among Mueller's team, Jenny Rhee donated $5,400 to Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. Andrew Weissman, a longtime Mueller associate, donated 6 times to President Obama's political action committees for a total of $4,700. James Quarles, an assistant special prosecutor on the Watergate Special Prosecution Force, donated more than 10 times to Democratic PACs over the last 30 years for presidential candidates Michael Dukakis, Al Gore, John Kerry, and Hillary Clinton. He's also donated to Republicans, including Utah Congressman Jason Chaffetz and former Virginia Governor George Allen. Add to those apparent political leanings the special counsel's potential limitless spending, paid out of DOJ's budget. Throw into the mix a prosecutor's power. In a scholarly article, law professor Glenn Reynolds wrote, quote, "The actual decision whether or not to charge a person with a crime is almost completely unconstrained. It all raises fundamental questions of fairness."
Most special prosecutors involved in this type of litigation would have avoided as much as possible people with political ties or contributions. When you're investigating the President of the United States, you should be trying to avoid any questions of political bias or influence.
The special counsel's office defends the hires, noting that department policy and federal law, quote, prohibits the special counsel from taking into consideration political affiliation in its hiring.
Just as troublesome to the White House, Mueller hire Michael Dreeben has argued on behalf of the government on the need to expand the definition of obstruction of justice, while the second hire, Andrew Weissman, has a reputation for aggressively turning witnesses. James?
Doug McElway, thank you. Fox News senior political analyst Bret Hume joins us tonight with his analysis. Bret, good evening. Great to have you. Given that Bob Mueller was the past director of the FBI, and he is a close friend, or at least a very close acquaintance of his successor, James Comey, who's now centrally at issue in all of this, do you think that Robert Mueller can lead an impartial investigation into all of this?
Well, I'm not ready to say he can't, but I think it is worrisome that he does have a pre-existing relationship with James Comey, who, if there is to be an obstruction of justice investigation, would certainly be a big part of that, not a witness perhaps, and that raises an ethical question that Mr. Mueller will have to answer. And it obviously would be worrisome. If I were a Trump lawyer, I'd be worried about the various Democratic donors who have been named to the team. Having said that, however, I would say that it takes a certain kind of person with a certain kind of integrity to resist the temptations that the Office of Special Counsel or Special Prosecutor inevitably brings, and that is to expand the investigation and keep hunting until you find something, Captain Ahab-like. Bob Mueller may well be the kind of man who can resist that temptation toward mission creep and prosecuting regardless.
Presumably, in appointing him, Rod Rosenstein considered some or all of this. It was announced over the weekend that President Trump has hired the veteran Washington litigator John Dowd to represent him, but other actions have raised questions whether Mr. Trump helps his own cause in all this, such as this statement to Lester Holt of NBC News about what motivated the firing of James Comey.
And in fact, when I decided to just do it, I said to myself, I said, you know, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story. It's an excuse by the Democrats for having lost an election that they should have won.
And on Friday, the president tweeted, "I am being investigated for firing the FBI director by the man who told me to fire the FBI director. Witch hunt." And earlier, Bret, the president tweeted that this quote-unquote witch hunt was being led by some bad and conflicted people. Does he help his case with these kinds of tweets?
My inclination would be to say no. First of all, you don't want to antagonize the people who are investigating you by raising questions about their integrity. Leave that to others. He's got plenty of people who can do that on his behalf. Newt Gingrich seems to be doing a fine job of doing that very thing. And he does not, and Newt Gingrich does not lack for platforms upon which to say such things. At the same time, I think, you know, the president seems to be at his best and strongest when he's tending to the issues and policies that have confronted him. His foreign trip is an example. His various statements in the aftermath of things that have gone wrong are further examples of that. So I don't think he's doing himself any good legally or politically by continuing to sound off in these short and sometimes intemperate tweets.
Bret Hume, thanks so much. The Navy is investigating the events of early Saturday morning local time when a cargo ship rammed an American destroyer in the waters off Japan, killing 7 American sailors. Areas under scrutiny include the exact time of the accident and why nearly an hour passed before it was reported to Japan's Coast Guard. Still ahead, Bret Baier talks to golf legend Jack Nicklaus. But first, another apparent terror. There has been another apparent terror incident in England. This time, a man driving a van plowed into a crowd of Muslim worshippers outside a mosque early today. Senior Foreign Affairs correspondent Amy Kellogg has the details from London tonight.
It was the imam of the Finsbury Park Mosque who got this angry mob to back off the man who had just plowed into a crowd of Muslims after late-night prayers. 47-year-old Darren Osborne was subsequently arrested by police. He faces terrorism charges, commission, instigation, and preparation of an attack.
The attack on Westminster Bridge, the attack on London Bridge, the attack in Manchester, the attack last night, all of these are attacks on our shared values of freedom, of tolerance, and of respect. And terrorism is terrorism, whether someone's inspired by an Islamist narrative or other forms of, inverted commas, inspiration.
Keep moving! Keep moving! There have been 4 terrorist attacks in the UK this year. Authorities agree this is a trying time for this multicultural city.
It was an attack that, once again, targeted the ordinary and the innocent, going about their daily lives. This time, British Muslims, as they left a mosque having broken their fast and prayed together at this sacred time of year.
One man who had felt ill and was being treated by friends on the street was killed when the van plowed into him outside a Muslim welfare center close to Finsbury Park Mosque. 9 were injured. While Islamist terror attacks grabbed the most headlines, hate crimes against Muslims and anti-Muslim sentiment are on the rise and are taking a toll on this community.
I have been born here. This is my country, and every day I feel less and less part of it, and it's not fair.
The Finsbury Park Mosque was a hotbed of extremist activity back in the 90s when Abu Hamza al-Masri, now serving a life sentence for terror in the United States, preached there. It has since cleaned up its act and is now a respectable and popular place of worship in London. Not much is known about the suspect at this point. He is from Wales, and neighbors interviewed said that his 4 children often played with Muslim kids on the block. James.
Amy Kellogg in London. House Majority Whip Steve Scalise continues to recover tonight at a Washington hospital from wounds sustained during that attack on a congressional baseball practice last week. We're learning more tonight about the role Alexandria, Virginia police officers played in stopping the shooter. Correspondent Ellison Barber is live tonight at the Alexandria Police Department. Good evening, Ellison.
Good evening, James. At the time of the shooting, federal law enforcement officials tell Fox News James T. Hodgkinson had a list on him that included the names of Republican lawmakers. Today, at this press conference, the Alexandria Police Department would not comment on that list, but they did talk about the bravery that their officers showed during this attack. The FBI is now leading the investigation into Wednesday's attack, but Chief Michael Brown's officers are the ones who responded as Hodgkinson fired shot after shot after shot at the congressional Republicans' baseball practice. Officer Kevin Jobe arrived first, then Officer Alexander Jensen.
These 2 officers, when confronted with the call, rolled up on the scene, stopped their vehicles, and I'll start with Officer Battaglia. She immediately started taking fire from the suspect, and she jumped out of the car and without cover and moved towards the firefight. Not away from it, towards it.
At least 2 Capitol Police officers were on scene when the shooting began and also engaged the suspect. Everyone injured is expected to recover. A few days ago, Democrats and Republicans walked onto a baseball field together. But even in trying times, politics can rear its head. Critics took issue with Scott Pelley, asking if this was self-inflicted.
It's time to ask whether the attack on the United States Congress yesterday was foreseeable, predictable, and to some degree self-inflicted. Too many leaders and political commentators who set an example for us to follow have led us into an abyss of violent rhetoric, which, it should be no surprise, has led to violence.
A Democratic strategist from New Jersey tweeted #HuntRepublicans and then pushed back on calls to apologize. And MSNBC's Joy Reid stirred up controversy when she tweeted, quote, Representative Scalise was shot by a white man with a violent background and saved by a black lesbian police officer. And yet,
he did come to leadership after some controversy over attending a white nationalist event, which he says he didn't know what it was. Because he is in jeopardy and everyone is pulling for him, are we required in a moral sense to put that aside at the moment?
What Joy Reid is doing is just appalling. Appalling. While Steve Scalise remains in a hospital bed fighting for his life, she's attacking him because she doesn't like his politics.
A blood drive in honor of the victims is expected to take place on Capitol Hill tomorrow morning, and then they're going to have another one on Thursday. It's being organized by Chief Deputy Whip Patrick McHenry. James?
Ellison Barber, thank you. As drug kingpin Joaquin El Chapo Guzman now sits in federal custody in New York awaiting trial, new details are emerging about what it took to bring this high-profile fugitive to justice. It involved two men serving their own time for drug crimes, expected to be the lead witnesses against El Chapo. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge has an exclusive interview with two women speaking on camera for the first time who were married into the cartel.
I came from a wonderful family of law enforcement. I never thought that I would enter in a world of drug trafficking.
We have to constantly hide. We have to constantly remember our lies.
You're sitting here with wigs and glasses, and how are you living your everyday lives?
I've moved several times just because of the security issue that I've been faced with. Like I said, I've been hunted.
Who's hunting you?
The Mexican cartel.
Stepping slightly out of the shadows, Olivia and Mia Flores, not their real names, grew up daughters of Chicago police officers. They are speaking out for the first time about their lives on the run and have written a book called Cartel Wives. The women are married to identical twin brothers, Pedro and Margarita Flores. The brothers rose from being local street drug dealers in the Windy City to running Joaquin El Chapo Guzman's drug empire in the U.S. In 2012, they were each sentenced to 14 years in prison for smuggling 71 tons of cocaine and heroin and $2 billion in cash. The Flores brothers were flipped by the DEA and key to bringing El Chapo to U.S. justice.
Your husbands are the principal witnesses at trial.
Yes, they were the first to ever get Chapo Guzman on a recorded conversation.
They spoke English. They knew the U.S. inside and out. They knew the roads. They knew how to maneuver in the U.S. And that's something Chapo and his team didn't know how to do.
Our husbands, they ran their business like a Fortune 500 company.
They have safe houses, they have couriers, they have transportation systems.
They had tractor trailers with compartments that would be able to move the drugs from LA to Chicago and the money back down to Mexico. They used to work at McDonald's, and they picked up a system where their stash workers would not cross paths with their money counters.
I think it was the largest criminal entity the world's ever seen.
Get him out! Get him out! That's Jack Riley, in action during his 33-year career at the DEA. The just-retired deputy administrator spent more than a decade hunting El Chapo.
Look, I hate the guy.
Was it personal for you?
When I was on the border some 10 years ago, slugging it out with what was going on in Juarez, he put a bounty on my head.
He put a hit on you?
Yeah, I was a little upset about it because it was only $100,000, but he put a bounty to have someone cut my head off. So it is personal with me. Right now, I got to tell you, I like where I sit, and I kind of like where he's sitting too. I saw that guy kill thousands of people in Mexico. I was there.
What would you say to the families whose lives were destroyed by those drugs?
We are very remorseful for the damage that's been caused. Our husbands, they denounced that life, and they tried to take something so negative and they tried to dismantle what they helped build, and that was bringing Chapo Guzman to a U.S. courtroom.
I understand. I'm a mother. I love my children, and it could be one of them also. But at the end of the day, what our husbands did, they put a dent in the drug trade. We did our part to say, I'm sorry, and we denounced this life.
Catherine Herridge, Fox News.
A surge in tech stocks led the Dow and the S&P 500 to record closes. The industrial average gained 145. The S&P 500 finished ahead 20. NASDAQ was up 87. We are less than 24 hours away from voting day in a special congressional election that carries implications far beyond the district boundaries in Georgia. Correspondent Jonathan Seri reports tonight from Atlanta.
Already the most expensive congressional race in U.S. history at over $50 million, both candidates in the 6th District are calling on heavy hitters with Georgia roots to get out the vote.
It's time to be making certain that you're asking every single individual that you see within the 6th District, have you voted?
Tom Price, who vacated the seat to become President Trump's Health and Human Services Secretary, stumped for Republican Karen Handel over the weekend, along with Agriculture Secretary and former Georgia Governor Sonny Perdue. Democrat John Ossoff was joined by Georgia Congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis.
With this election, it will indicate that people are prepared to change, and I think many people will see the handwriting on the wall.
The Real Clear Politics average of polls shows Ossoff with a slight lead of 49.3% to Handel's 47.8% in a district that normally favors establishment Republicans.
This is exactly the type of district they hope they can win if they can retake the House in 2018. There's 24 seats they need to win. A lot of them are going to be these fast-changing suburban districts that Republicans have long held.
District 6 voters have already cast more than 140,000 early ballots, double the number of early votes in the April 18 primary. Some polls show nearly 15% of Republicans favor Ossoff. And to flip the district blue, the Democrat is appealing to moderate Republicans and independents.
I think this is an opportunity for Georgia to elect some fresh leadership that's focused on delivering results for folks at home, focused on holding people accountable in Washington.
In a district that Trump only won by less than 2 points, Handel is rallying the conservative base by linking her opponent to left-wing Democrats.
And we are going to rock Nancy Pelosi's world.
Both campaigns have beefed up security after receiving threats, including letters with a white powder sent to Handel and her neighbors. In a quieter and far less expensive race, the congressional seat last held by Trump's budget director, former South Carolina Congressman Mick Mulvaney, is also up for grabs tomorrow. James?
Jonathan, thank you. And we will bring you the results from the Georgia special election during a special late-night edition of Special Report, hosted by Bret Baier, Tuesday at 11 p.m. Eastern. Are we inching ahead to an armed conflict with Russia? Just ahead on Special Report, we'll talk about the downing of that Syrian warplane by U.S. forces when the panel joins me right after this break.
We call on the U.S. and all the others who have forces or advisors on the ground to ensure our work is coordinated.
We have an effective link between our operations center in Qatar and the Russian Federation on the ground in Syria. I'm confident that we are still communicating between our operations center and the Russian Federation operations center, and I'm also confident that our forces have the capability to take care of themselves.
Top officials from the Kremlin and the Pentagon speaking out after the U.S. downed a Syrian Air Force jet, and Russia vowed similar action if U.S. pilots stray beyond designated zones. Let's bring in our panel. Matt Schlapp, contributor with The Hill, Bloomberg News White House reporter Jennifer Jacobs, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Charles, to you first. With the Russians drawing lines in the air like this, are we in a new Cold War?
Well, we've been in a new Cold War ever since Putin came into power, but it's not exactly at the same level of risk as the old Cold War. The Russians are very careful. They made a similar announcement after we did the Tomahawk attack with the cruise missiles that they would cut off communications. It didn't happen. In the soundbite you showed of Lavrov, the foreign minister, speaking, he was conciliatory, saying, I hope the communication continues. So it sounds as if there's a lot of bark here coming out of the defense ministry from Moscow, because they have to show, the Russians have to show the Syrians, we are your patrons, we're not going to stand by. But the larger picture is all this maneuvering is about the post-ISIS Syria. They both assume ISIS is going to be wiped away fairly soon. And the question is, will Assad be able to restore, with the Russians and the Iranians, full control over the country, including the part that is now ISIS? Or will that be a kind of semi-independent rebel territory? and Assad regime will be kind of a mini-state. That's what this maneuvering is about. I don't expect that we're going to have a conflict with the Russians, but we are going to have a long tussle on the ground with the forces who support Assad, the forces who are against, taking over in the absence of ISIS within a few months.
I don't think we're going to have an answer to the question you posed about what a post-ISIS Syria will look like. Jennifer, for all the talk about alleged collusion between President Trump and the Russians, the president has taken some hard lines with the Kremlin, including the shoot-down of the Syrian jet that we saw. Obama-era sanctions on Russia following its annexation of Crimea have remained in place. And, of course, there have been some sharp words of condemnation for Russia's support of the Assad regime, particularly in the wake of that deadly chemical attack in April.
Today morning, we awoke to pictures, to children foaming at the mouth, suffering convulsions. How many more children have to die before Russia cares?
So, Jennifer, is this what anyone would have imagined that the U.S.-Russian relationship would look like back on Inauguration Day?
Oh, my goodness. Well, there already have been some people who have called out, this action as a way for Trump to distract from some of his past comments that have been very generous to Russia. I do not think that that's the case, that Trump is trying to distract from this. Obviously, there have been provocations by the pro-Assad regime coalition forces several times over the last few weeks. The big theme around the White House today was de-escalation, de-escalation, talking about how they have not wanted to see this escalate. They do not want to see this escalate, downplaying this quite a bit, talking about how they're going to keep open lines of communication with Russia. The thinking today was, listen, Russia had, threatened to cancel that deconfliction agreement to prevent those mid-air collisions once before, back when Trump said the Tomahawk missiles as the retaliation for the chemical strikes. But then, that agreement is still in place. They're again threatening to cancel that, but they're thinking that things are going to be able to be smoothed over. There's a very calm, unified voice right now.
Bottom line, Russia doesn't seem to be getting all it wants, or even most of what it wants, from the Trump presidency so far, correct?
Exactly. Yeah.
All right, so we also have the continuing story about the investigation into alleged contacts with the Russians, and there was a fascinating exchange on Fox News Sunday between our own Chris Wallace and one of the newer members of the Trump defense team, attorney Jay Sekulow.
And now he's being investigated by the Department of Justice, because the special counsel, under the special counsel regulations, reports still to the Department of Justice, not an independent counsel. So he's being investigated for taking the action that the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General recommended him to take.
You stated some facts. First of all, you've now said that he is being investigated after saying that you didn't.
No.
You just said,
no, he's
sir,
not being investigated.
You just said that he's being investigated.
No, Chris, I said that let me be crystal clear so you completely understand. We have not received, nor are we aware of any investigation of the President of the United States.
Sir, you just said...
Period.
Matt Schlapp, was that crystal clear for you?
I would like to define some terms. We keep talking about whether or not the president's being investigated or not. It's pretty loose. The fact is that Team Trump is involved in this investigation to see whether or not there's collusion between his former campaign and the Russians. So that's the first step. So people get confused and say, oh, that means Donald Trump is a target of the investigation. Is he a target or not? Now, we have this loose leak that has come out of the Washington Post saying, once again, the inference is Donald Trump is a target of the investigation.
Not for collusion, but for something else, correct? Which was
firing Comey and obstruction of justice.
Obstruction of justice.
That's right. So this is, but here's what we all have to kind of take a breath on. I don't want to hear about any of this until we actually hear from the counsel, until Jay Sekulow hears from the office of the special counsel about who is a target and who is not a target. So all the hyperventilating over this, I think, is a big mistake. And I think as far as Jay's appearances on the Sunday shows, I think the point was made over and over and over again, which is, hey, he's not a target. We haven't been notified that he's a target. And the wider investigation continues.
And very quickly, 10 seconds for this, Matt. Do you regard that this president is in trouble?
Well, look, they're going to find something. There's no question that there's going to be something. There's not nothing to this, but there's nothing major to it, and there's no collusion with the Russians, with Trump's involvement with collusion with the Russians. That whole issue, even the Democrats are letting that go. They're moving on to other topics.
All right, panel.